Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. Welcome back to Horror Night Whispers. Tonight, we descend into the silent places where the dead are meant to rest, but don't. This episode draws from county maintenance archives, deputy logs never meant to surface, and psychiatric intake records sealed for decades. The stories you will hear were reconstructed from testimonies given by men who no longer speak, from photographs that should not exist, and from graves that refuse to stay closed. In rural Pennsylvania, where the fog settles thick between limestone markers and the soil remembers every name carved above it, something watches from the shadows of old elms. Something patient, something hungry. If you've ever walked through a cemetery at night and felt eyes on your back, you already know what waits in these stories. Subscribe now and stay close. The ground is soft tonight. The first account comes from a county maintenance archive dated 1987, filed under a classification that has since been removed from official record-keeping protocols. Personnel, incident, unexplained. The document was never meant to be digitized. It was discovered folded inside a water-damaged cardboard box in a storage facility that had been scheduled for demolition in 2014. The name on the incident report was Marcus Bellwether. He had worked the night shift at Hollow Ridge Cemetery in Cambria County, Pennsylvania, for 11 years without a single complaint, a single absence, or a single deviation from his carefully maintained routine. Hollow Ridge sat at the edge of a town that had already begun dying by the time Marcus took the job. The coal had run out decades earlier, and the families who stayed did so only because leaving felt like surrender. The cemetery itself sprawled across 7 acres of sloped land, bordered on 3 sides by dense woods and on the 4th by a rusted iron fence that hadn't been painted since 1962. The oldest graves dated back to 1843. The newest ones were dug by Marcus himself, usually alone, usually at night, when the families weren't watching and the earth was cool enough to cut cleanly. He preferred the silence. He had told his supervisor this during his initial interview, and the statement had been noted in his file with neither approval nor concern. Marcus Bellwether was not a man who sought company. He arrived at the cemetery each evening at 7, signed the logbook in the maintenance shed, retrieved his equipment, and walked the grounds in a pattern he had refined over more than a decade. He checked the locks on the mausoleum. He cleared debris from the older plots. He monitored the drainage near Section F, where the water table rose unpredictably in autumn. And when a new grave needed digging, he dug it with the slow, methodical patience of a man who understood that the dead were not in a hurry. His reports were meticulous. Every shift produced a handwritten log detailing temperature, weather conditions, equipment status, and any irregularities observed. For 11 years, the irregularities section remained empty. Then came September 1987. The first entry that month noted a minor disturbance. Soil displacement near an older plot in Section D, possibly caused by animal activity. Marcus had reseeded the area and moved on. 3 nights later, he recorded a second note, a smell he could not identify, faint but persistent, emanating from the same section. He described it as wet fabric and something underneath. He did not elaborate. On September 12th, he wrote a single sentence that would later be circled in red ink by an investigator whose name was redacted from the file. Heard digging tonight. Not mine. There was no follow-up to that entry. No indication that he reported it to anyone. The next 2 nights, his logs were unusually brief: weather, temperature, equipment check, nothing else. His handwriting, previously steady, had begun to slant. On the night of September 14th, Marcus Bellwether was assigned to dig a new grave in Section D. The plot belonged to a woman named Edith Marsh, who had died 6 days earlier in a house fire on the outskirts of town. The circumstances of her death had been ruled accidental, though the neighbors who had known her for 40 years said she had not smoked a day in her life and had been terrified of candles since childhood. The fire had started in her bedroom at 3 a.m. The doors had been locked from the inside. Her body had been recovered in a seated position at the foot of her bed, her hands folded in her lap, as though she had been waiting. Marcus arrived at the cemetery at his usual time. He signed the logbook. He retrieved his shovel and his lantern, and walked the familiar path toward Section D. The moon was a sliver that night, barely enough light to distinguish the headstones from the shadows between them. He had dug hundreds of graves in darkness deeper than this. It did not trouble him. The plot for Edith Marsh was located beneath an old elm tree that had stood at the center of Section D for as long as anyone could remember. Its branches spread wide and low, and in autumn, its leaves fell in such quantities that Marcus spent entire shifts clearing them from the surrounding graves. That night, the tree was still. No wind, no rustle. The air smelled of damp soil and something faintly metallic, like old pennies left in rain. He began digging at 8:47 p.m. His lantern cast a small circle of yellow light around the plot, enough to see his shovel bite into the earth, enough to see the pile of dirt growing beside him. The work was rhythmic, automatic. His muscles knew the motions without instruction. He did not need to think about what he was doing. He did not need to think about anything at all. At 9:23 p.m., he radioed the maintenance shed to report his progress. His voice, according to the recording that was later recovered from the county archive, was flat and unhurried. Grave prep on schedule. Section D should be finished by 11. The dispatcher acknowledged the transmission and logged the time. At 9:41 p.m., Marcus radioed again. This transmission was shorter. His voice had changed. "There's someone out here." The dispatcher asked him to repeat. Marcus did not respond. At 9:58 p.m., the dispatcher attempted to reach him. No answer. At 10:15 p.m., a deputy was sent to investigate. Deputy Harold Vance arrived at Hollow Ridge Cemetery at 10:34 p.m. He parked his cruiser near the maintenance shed and retrieved his flashlight. The cemetery was silent. No crickets, no wind. He later described the quiet as unnatural, as though the air itself had been held in place by something he could not see. He walked the main path toward Section D, calling Marcus's name. No response. He found the groundskeeper standing beside the open grave, motionless. The lantern was still lit, resting on the grass a few feet away. The shovel was embedded in the earth at an angle that suggested it had been dropped mid-swing, the handle tilting toward the darkness beyond the tree. Marcus's arms hung at his sides. His eyes were open, fixed on a point somewhere in front of him, unblinking. His mouth hung slack, his lips slightly parted, as though he had been about to speak and forgotten how. Deputy Vance called his name. Marcus did not respond. He waved a hand in front of the man's face. Nothing. He touched his shoulder, shook him gently, then harder. Marcus Bellwether remained standing, breathing, alive, but absent. Whatever had been inside him had left. The deputy radioed for medical assistance. As he waited, he shone his flashlight around the grave, documenting the scene out of habit. The hole was approximately 4 feet deep. The soil was loose and dark. The smell was stronger here, damp and sour, with an undertone of something he could not name but would never forget. And then his flashlight swept across the far edge of the grave, and he stopped. There was a woman standing beneath the elm tree. She was perhaps 30 feet away, motionless, her form half obscured by the low-hanging branches. She wore a burial dress, gray, sodden, clinging to her frame as though she had just crawled out of wet earth. Her skin was the color of old wax. Her hair hung in tangled ropes across her face. She was watching Marcus, not the deputy, not the flashlight. She was watching Marcus with an expression that Deputy Vance would later describe. In a personal log he never submitted to his superiors. As patient hunger, he called out to her. She did not move. He took a step forward, his flashlight trained on her face, and for a single, frozen moment, he saw her clearly. Her eyes were open too wide, too dark, the pupils swallowing the white entirely. Her lips were pulled back in a smile that showed teeth blackened and broken, the gums receded to the bone. She was smiling at Marcus. She was smiling as though she had been waiting for him for a very long time. Deputy Vance blinked. The woman was gone. Not retreating, not fading, simply absent, as though she had never been there at all. He swept his flashlight across the tree line, across the graves, across every shadow within reach. Nothing. The smell lingered. The silence pressed down, and Marcus Bellwether stood exactly where he had been. His eyes still fixed on the place where she had stood, his lips still parted, his breath shallow and uneven. It took 2 paramedics to physically carry him to the ambulance. His body did not resist, but it did not cooperate either. His muscles had locked into a kind of passive rigidity, as though his mind had simply stopped sending signals to his limbs. He was admitted to Cambria General Hospital under observation. He did not speak. He did not eat unless fed. He did not close his eyes unless sedated. The attending physician noted in his file that the patient appeared to be in a persistent catatonic state of unknown origin, unresponsive to all stimuli except one. When a nurse accidentally dropped a metal tray near his bed, Marcus flinched and turned his head toward the window, his eyes wide, his mouth open, a single syllable escaping his throat before he fell silent again. The nurse could not be certain what he had said. She thought it might have been a name. 3 months later, Marcus Bellwether was committed to a state psychiatric facility in western Pennsylvania. His family had exhausted their resources. His condition had not improved. He would spend the remaining years of his life in a small room with barred windows, attended by staff who learned not to speak to him and not to ask about the drawings. The drawings appeared within weeks of his admission. Charcoal on paper, repeated dozens of times, sometimes hundreds. The same image, over and over, filling notebooks and covering walls when no one was watching. A woman climbing out of the ground, her arms extended, her fingers bent like hooks, her burial dress hanging in wet folds around her frame. Her face was always turned toward the viewer. Her mouth was always open, her teeth were always black, and she was always smiling. The staff eventually removed his drawing materials. He began scratching the image into the plaster with his fingernails. They restrained his hands. He stopped eating. They gave him the charcoal back. He died in 1994. Still silent. Still drawing. His personal effects were catalogued and archived. The drawings were destroyed. The grave Marcus Bellwether had been digging that night was completed by another groundskeeper the following morning. Edith Marsh's coffin was lowered at noon. The burial proceeded without incident. The family left. The cemetery returned to silence. 6 months later, a county inspector conducting a routine audit of burial records ordered the exhumation of a coffin in Section D after discrepancies were found in the paperwork. The coffin in question belonged to Edith Marsh. When it was opened, the inspector noted 2 details that were never included in the official report, but were recorded in a handwritten memo that was later found in the same storage box as Marcus Bellwether's incident file. The first detail. The interior of the coffin lid was covered in deep scratch marks, concentrated near the center, gouged into the wood with what appeared to be human fingernails. The second detail. The body inside was lying face down. The coffin was resealed without explanation. The memo was filed and forgotten. The storage box was placed on a shelf in a facility that no longer exists. And beneath the old elm in Section D, where the fog settles thick on autumn nights and the soil stays damp no matter how long it goes without rain, the groundskeepers at Hollow Ridge Cemetery still refuse to work alone. Some of them say they have seen her a shape at the edge of their lantern light, motionless, watching, a woman in gray, a smile full of broken teeth. They do not speak of it officially. They do not report it in their logs. But they dig faster now, and they leave before midnight, and they never, ever look toward the tree. Some graves, it seems, do not stay closed, and some of the dead do not stay buried. They wait, they watch, and when the time is right, they climb. Now we will begin our second story. St. Jerome's Catholic Cemetery sits on 11 acres of sloping Ohio farmland, bordered on 3 sides by soybean fields, and on the 4th by a crumbling access road that hasn't been repaved since 1978. The cemetery itself dates back to 1847, when German immigrants established the first Catholic parish in the county and consecrated the ground with prayers spoken in a language most of their descendants would never learn. By 2003, The cemetery held over 4,000 graves, arranged in uneven rows that followed the natural contours of the land. The oldest stones near the front entrance had weathered into illegibility, their inscriptions erased by a century and a half of rain and frost. The newer sections stretched toward the rear of the property, where a single mausoleum stood apart from the common graves, built from imported Italian marble that still gleamed white against the surrounding grey. The Ashworth Mausoleum had been constructed in 1902 by Frederick Ashworth, a railroad investor who had made his fortune during the expansion of the Pennsylvania lines into Ohio's coal country. The structure was modest by the standards of Gilded Age excess, a 12-foot cube with Corinthian columns flanking a wrought iron gate, topped by a copper roof that had long since oxidized to a pale green. 3 generations of Ashworths rested inside, their names engraved on bronze plaques that lined the interior walls. The mausoleum sat at the highest point of the cemetery, overlooking the older graves like a sentinel. Behind it, the land dropped sharply into a shallow depression where groundwater collected after heavy rains, creating a patch of earth that never fully dried, even in summer. The vandalism problem at Street Jerome's began in the fall of 2002, when someone spray-painted obscenities on several headstones near the main gate. The incidents continued sporadically through the winter: overturned flower urns, broken solar lights, beer bottles left on grave markers. The parish council, unable to afford a security guard, installed a single motion-activated camera on a utility pole near the cemetery's entrance. The camera was a consumer-grade model purchased from a Radio Shack in Steubenville, capable of recording 8 hours of grainy black and white footage onto VHS tapes that the groundskeeper replaced every morning. Daniel Vance was 17 years old in the spring of 2003, a junior at the regional high school located 12 miles west of the cemetery. His friends would later describe him as quiet, unremarkable, the kind of kid who blended into the background of every group photograph. He played JV basketball without distinction, maintained a B- average, and had never been in serious trouble. His only notable quality, according to those who knew him, was his reluctance to back down from a dare. This trait had led to a series of minor humiliations over the years: eating a live cricket in the 7th grade, climbing a water tower on a bet, spending an entire lunch period with his hand submerged in ice water. The dare that brought him to Street Jerome Cemetery on the night of April 14, 2003, came from a classmate whose name has never been released to the public. The security footage recovered from that night shows Daniel entering through the cemetery's main gate at precisely 11:47 p.m. He is wearing jeans, a dark hooded sweatshirt, and white athletic shoes that appear bright against the gravel path. In his right hand, he carries a flashlight, a yellow plastic model that investigators would later identify as a standard hardware store brand. His movements are hesitant but deliberate, the posture of someone who is committed to a course of action and refuses to reconsider. He follows the central path for approximately 40 seconds before veering right toward the rear of the property where the Ashworth Mausoleum stands. The camera's field of view does not extend beyond the 3rd row of headstones. Daniel Vance walks out of frame at 11:48 p.m. and does not reappear. The search began the following afternoon when Daniel's mother reported him missing after he failed to return home from what he had told her was an overnight stay at a friend's house. The friend, when questioned, admitted that Daniel had left around 11 o'clock, saying only that he had something to prove. Sheriff's deputies arrived at Street Jerome's Cemetery by 4 o'clock, accompanied by the groundskeeper who provided access to the security footage. The tape confirmed that Daniel had entered the cemetery, but offered no evidence of his departure. A systematic search of the grounds commenced before sunset. The Ashworth Mausoleum became the focal point within the first hour. Daniel's stated destination, according to the friend who had issued the dare, was the back wall of the mausoleum, where local legend claimed that anyone who stood alone at midnight would hear voices speaking from inside. The dare had been simple: walk to the mausoleum, touch the back wall, and return. Daniel never completed this task. Deputies found the first piece of evidence, 14 steps behind the mausoleum's rear wall. The measurement was precise because one of the investigators, a man named Harold Pence, who had served with the department for 23 years, counted each step himself. The flashlight stood upright on the grass, positioned with its lens pointing toward the sky, as though someone had carefully balanced it in that exact orientation before walking away. The battery, when tested, was completely dead, a fact that troubled investigators, since the flashlight model in question was rated for 12 hours of continuous use on fresh batteries, and Daniel's mother confirmed he had purchased a new pack the previous week. 6 feet beyond the flashlight, Daniel's shoes waited in the damp grass. White athletic sneakers, size 10, positioned side by side with approximately 3 inches of space between them. The laces remained tied, the tongues folded forward as though the shoes had simply been stepped out of and left behind. No footprints led away from the spot. The ground, despite its moisture, showed no indication of struggle, no sign that anyone had dragged or carried the shoe's owner in any direction. The search expanded to include dogs, volunteers, and eventually a cadaver team from Columbus. No trace of Daniel Vance was ever recovered. The official investigation file, sealed by court order in 2004, runs to 412 pages. It documents interviews with family members, classmates, teachers, and neighbors. It includes soil analyses, weather reports, and a detailed timeline of Daniel's final known movements. What it does not include, what was deliberately excluded from the public record, are the statements provided by 2 cemetery groundskeepers in the weeks following Daniel's disappearance. The first groundskeeper, a man named Eugene Kroll, who had maintained Street Jerome's for 11 years, requested an interview with investigators on April 29, 2003. His statement, preserved only in handwritten notes that were never transcribed into the official file, describes what he observed when reviewing the security footage frame by frame. Eugene had examined the tape dozens of times, studying Daniel's approach to the mausoleum, searching for any detail that might explain what happened. On his 37th viewing, he noticed something in the background that he had previously overlooked. The Ashworth Mausoleum's iron gate is visible in the footage for approximately 15 seconds as Daniel walks toward it. The gate is closed, as it had been for 84 years, secured by a padlock that the groundskeepers replaced every decade. Behind the gate, the mausoleum's interior is almost entirely dark, lit only by whatever ambient light penetrates the structure's small stained glass window. In most frames, this interior appears as a uniform black rectangle, but in 7 consecutive frames, less than a quarter of a second of footage, something is visible behind the iron bars. Eugene described what he saw as a figure standing just inside the gate, occupying a space approximately 3 feet behind the bars. The figure was tall, he said, taller than the doorframe would seem to allow, with proportions that struck him as fundamentally wrong. The torso was too long, the limbs too thin, the head positioned at an angle that suggested either a broken neck or a physiology that did not conform to human anatomy. But the detail that Eugene could not stop describing, the detail that caused him to request immediate reassignment to another parish property, was the figure's face. He said it looked like wet cloth, like skin that had been removed from the underlying bone structure and draped loosely over a different skull, one that was longer and narrower than it should have been. The features were present: eyes, nose, mouth, but they hung slack, disconnected from any musculature that might animate them. The mouth, in particular, appeared to sag open, creating a dark oval at the bottom of the face that Eugene said reminded him of a drain. The second groundskeeper, a younger man named Paul Medina, who had worked at Street Jerome's for only 8 months, provided a separate statement 3 days later. He had not spoken with Eugene prior to his interview. He described the same figure, the same location, the same loose and hanging face. He added one detail that Eugene had not mentioned: the figure's hands were visible, gripping the iron bars from inside the mausoleum, and the fingers were too long, extending well past the width of the bars themselves. Both men requested transfers. Eugene was reassigned to a parish in Wheeling, West Virginia, where he retired in 2011. Paul left groundskeeping entirely and, according to public records, enrolled in a seminary the following year. Neither man has spoken publicly about what they witnessed. The Ashworth Mausoleum contains 6 interment spaces, 5 of which are occupied by documented remains. Frederick Ashworth, his wife Margaret, their eldest son Frederick Jr., his wife Eleanor, and their daughter Catherine, all buried between 1902 and 1956, all accounted for in parish records. The sixth space belongs to William Ashworth, the youngest child of Frederick Jr. and Eleanor, who drowned in the Ohio River on August 3rd, 1919, at the age of 7. Church records from that period note that William's body was never recovered. The river had been running high following a week of storms, and despite extensive searching, no trace of the boy was found. His parents, devastated and devout, insisted on a proper burial regardless. The parish priest agreed to consecrate an empty coffin, which was interred in the family mausoleum on August 17, 1919. The ceremony was brief and private. The iron gate was locked afterward and has not been officially opened since. The investigative file contains no explanation for what occupied the mausoleum when Daniel Vance approached it 84 years later. It offers no theory for how a figure could appear in 7 frames of security footage and then vanish, or why a teenage boy would abandon his flashlight and shoes 14 steps behind a structure he had been dared to touch. The file reaches no conclusions because the evidence permits none. It simply records what was found and what was not. Daniel Vance's mother maintained his bedroom exactly as he left it until her death in 2019. His father, who had divorced from the family when Daniel was 9, attended the memorial service held 1 year after the disappearance, but has not been seen in the county since. The classmate who issued the dare dropped out of school before graduation and reportedly moved to Arizona, though this has never been confirmed. St. Jerome's Catholic Cemetery remains operational, though attendance at burials has declined significantly since 2003. The security camera was removed in 2007 after repeated malfunctions that no technician could explain. The groundskeeping staff now consists of a single part-time employee who works exclusively during daylight hours and has standing instructions never to approach the rear of the property alone. The Ashworth Mausoleum stands where it has always stood, its marble walls unstained by time, its copper roof green with age, its iron gate locked against entry. Behind it, the ground slopes down into that shallow depression where water collects after rain, where the grass grows thick and wet even in drought years, where a flashlight once stood upright as though placed there by careful hands. 14 steps. No one walks them anymore. No one counts them. No one approaches the back wall of the mausoleum after dark. Not on a dare. Not for any reason. But the groundskeeper who works there now, the one who keeps to daylight, who never ventures past the 3rd row of headstones, has reported something to the parish council that has not been included in any official document. On certain evenings, just before sunset, when the shadows stretch long across the graves and the air grows still, he has seen movement behind the mausoleum's iron gate. Not a figure, exactly. Not anything he could describe with confidence. Just the suggestion of something standing there, watching, waiting, as though 84 years were not long enough, as though patience were the only quality it had ever possessed. The Catholic Diocese of Youngstown has declined to comment on the Ashworth Mausoleum or its contents, citing privacy concerns for the family and the ongoing nature of what they describe as an unresolved missing persons case. The case file remains sealed. The investigation remains officially open. And somewhere in eastern Ohio, in a cemetery that most people avoid after dark, a gate stands locked against a darkness that may have learned how to wait. Now we will begin our 3rd story. Briarwood Memorial Park spreads across 17 acres of rolling Virginia hillside, its oldest section dating back to the Civil War. Its iron gates rusted the color of dried blood. The cemetery sits 3 miles outside the town of Whitmore Falls, accessible by a single 2-lane road that winds through dense forest before opening onto the grounds. At night, the only light comes from a single lamp mounted above the caretaker's shed and whatever the moon chooses to offer. In October of 1994, the moon offered very little. The trees surrounding Briarwood had already shed most of their leaves, and the branches stood bare and skeletal against the sky, clicking together in the wind like the fingers of the dead reaching for something just beyond their grasp. Earl Combs had worked as the night watchman at Briarwood Memorial Park for 11 years. He was 53 years old, a Navy veteran, a man who had seen combat in Vietnam and returned home with the kind of quiet steadiness that made him ideal for solitary work. He did not believe in ghosts. He did not believe in omens. He believed in locked gates, scheduled rounds, and the reliability of his flashlight. His job was simple: walk the grounds once every 2 hours, check the perimeter fence for gaps, make sure no teenagers had climbed over to drink or vandalize, file a report if anything seemed out of place. In 11 years, he had filed exactly 4 reports, 3 for vandalism and 1 for a deer that had died near the columbarium. The night of October 17th began like any other. Earl arrived at 9 in the evening, unlocked the shed, logged his start time, and made his first round at 10. The air was cold, but not bitter, carrying the smell of decaying leaves and distant wood smoke. The older section of the cemetery, where the Civil War dead lay beneath moss-covered stones, was always the quietest. The newer section, closer to the main road, sometimes caught noise from passing cars. But the old section sat in a depression of land, sheltered by a ring of oak trees that had been planted over a century ago. Sound did not travel there. It collected, it pooled. Earl had always found it peaceful. That night, he found it waiting. His second round began at midnight. The temperature had dropped several degrees, and a thin mist had begun to rise from the ground, curling around the headstones like something alive. Earl noted this in his log but thought nothing of it. Mist was common in October. Mist was natural. He walked his usual route, flashlight beams sweeping left and right, boots crunching on the gravel path. Everything appeared normal. The gates were secure. The fence was intact. No signs of intrusion. He returned to the shed, poured himself coffee from his thermos, and waited for his next round. At 2:15 a.m., Earl Combs began his third patrol of the night. He walked the newer section first, then cut through the central lawn toward the older graves. The mist had thickened. It hung at knee-height now, dense and gray, and his flashlight beam seemed to lose strength as it passed through. He could see perhaps 20 feet ahead. No more. The silence was absolute. No wind, no insects, no distant cars, just the sound of his own breathing and the soft crunch of his footsteps on the path. He had walked this route over 4,000 times. He knew every turn, every dip, every headstone that tilted slightly to the left. He knew when something was wrong. The figure appeared at the edge of his flashlight beam like something materializing from the mist itself. A woman, kneeling before a headstone in the oldest part of the cemetery, her back to him. She wore a pale blue dress that seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. Her shoulders shook with what appeared to be weeping. Earl stopped. His first thought was practical. How had she gotten in? The gates were locked. The fence was 8 feet high and topped with decorative iron spikes. His second thought was concern. Was she hurt? Had something happened? He approached slowly, keeping his flashlight beam low so as not to startle her. As he drew closer, Earl noticed details that made him slow his pace. The woman's dress was soaked through, clinging to her body as though she had just emerged from water. Dark patches spread across the pale blue fabric, and droplets fell from the hem onto the grass below. Her hair hung in wet strands across her face and down her back, plastered to her skin. But there had been no rain. The mist was thick, yes, but not wet enough to soak clothing. Earl had been outside for hours, and his jacket was barely damp. He stopped 10 feet behind her and cleared his throat. "Ma'am, are you all right?" She did not respond. Her shoulders continued to shake, and Earl could hear now the sound she was making, a low, wet keening that seemed to come from somewhere deep in her chest. It did not sound like crying, it sounded like drowning, like someone trying to breathe through lungs filled with water. Earl felt the first cold finger of unease trace down his spine. He stepped closer. "Ma'am, the cemetery is closed. How did you get in here?" No response. The wet keening continued, rhythmic and horrible, punctuated by sounds that might have been words but were too waterlogged to understand. Earl circled around to the side, trying to see her face, trying to read the headstone she knelt before. His flashlight beam swept across the weathered granite, illuminating letters carved deep into the stone. He read them once, then read them again, because the first time his brain refused to accept what his eyes were seeing. Caroline Ann Whitmore, beloved daughter, 1962, 1994. May she find peace in still waters. Earl knew that name. Everyone in Whitmore Falls knew that name. Caroline Whitmore had drowned in Blackwell Lake 3 weeks ago. The story had been in the papers, on the local news, whispered about in diners and churches. She had gone swimming alone at night, something she had done 100 times before. But this time she had not come back. Her car was found at the lake's edge the next morning. Her body was not recovered for 9 days. By then, the water had done its work. The funeral had been closed casket. Earl had not attended, but he had heard the talk. He had heard what the water had done to her. The woman looked up. Earl Combs had seen death before. He had seen it in rice paddies and jungle clearings. He had seen what bullets and shrapnel and fire could do to a human body. He had thought he understood the limits of what the dead could look like. He was wrong. The face that turned toward him was bloated and gray, swollen with 9 days of submersion, the skin stretched tight in some places and sagging loose in others. Her lips were blue-black and pulled back from teeth that seemed too large for her mouth. But it was her eyes that broke something inside Earl Combs. They were open, wide open, and they were filled with black water. Not tears. Water. Dark lake water that spilled down her swollen cheeks in endless streams, pouring from her eye sockets like something that could never be emptied. She opened her mouth, and more water came out. Gallons of it. Impossible amounts. Flooding down her chin and chest and pooling on the grass around her knees. Earl ran. He did not remember the route he took back to the shed. He did not remember unlocking the door or slamming it behind him or pushing his desk against it as a barricade. He remembered only the sound of his own heartbeat and the distant, impossible sound of wet footsteps on gravel, slow and deliberate, coming closer. He stayed in that shed until dawn, his service pistol drawn, his flashlight clutched in his shaking hand. When the sun finally rose, he walked to the parking lot, got in his truck, and drove directly to the cemetery's administrative office. He submitted his resignation in person, effective immediately. He did not explain why. He did not need to. The administrator who took his paperwork would later note that Earl Combs looked like a man who had aged 20 years overnight. The official caretaker logs from that night were filed and forgotten, then quietly removed from the archives sometime in the late 1992. They were only recovered in 2011 through a Freedom of Information request filed by a researcher investigating unexplained incidents at Virginia burial sites. Earl's report was clinical in its language but devastating in its implications. He described the figure, the dress, the impossible wetness. He described the face. He described the black water that poured from her eyes. He described the sound of footsteps following him back to the shed. What the report did not include was what happened to Earl Combs in the weeks that followed. Earl did not return to work anywhere. He did not leave his house. Neighbors reported seeing him standing at his windows at odd hours, staring out at the street with an expression of absolute terror. His sister, who visited him 2 weeks after his resignation, found him sitting in the dark with every light in the house burned out, muttering about water damage, about wet footprints on the carpet, about a woman who stood at the foot of his bed every night and wept black tears onto his sheets. She begged him to see a doctor. He refused. He told her that doctors could not help him. He told her that Caroline Whitmore wanted him to visit her grave. He told her that Caroline Whitmore was waiting. 3 weeks after the incident at Briarwood Memorial Park, Earl Combs was admitted to the Western State Psychiatric Hospital in Staunton, Virginia. The admission paperwork noted that he was found by police officers responding to a welfare check, sitting in his bathtub fully clothed. The water running, repeating the same phrase over and over. She's still wet. She's always wet. She wants me to come see her. He would spend the next 4 years in that facility. And Maber, and Daughter, Window Velody, Window this playing, Window this want playing, window validity. His treatment records, also obtained through Freedom of Information requests, paint a picture of a man in irreversible psychological collapse. He reported nightly visitations. He reported the smell of lake water in his room. He reported waking to find his pillow soaked through, his sheets damp, his floor marked with wet footprints that led from his door to his bed and back again. The attending psychiatrists diagnosed him with acute stress disorder, then PTSD, then schizophrenia. None of the treatments helped. None of the medications stopped the visitations. Earl Combs was released from Western State in 1998. He moved to a small apartment in Richmond, as far from Whitmore Falls as he could afford to go. He lived quietly. He did not speak about what had happened. He did not return to Briarwood Memorial Park. But in the spring of 2003, nearly 9 years after that October night, Earl Combs drove back to Whitmore Falls. He drove to Briarwood Memorial Park. He parked his car outside the gates, climbed the fence despite his age and failing health, and walked to the oldest section of the cemetery. A groundskeeper found his body the next morning, lying face down on the grass before the headstone of Caroline Ann Whitmore. The coroner's report listed the cause of death as cardiac arrest. The groundskeeper's statement, which was not included in the official report, noted that Earl Combs' clothing was soaked through with water, that his mouth and nose were filled with dark sediment, and that the grass around the grave was wet despite 3 weeks without rain. Caroline Whitmore's grave remains at Briarwood Memorial Park. The headstone has been cleaned and maintained over the years, though no family members have visited since her mother passed in 2007. Night watchmen at the cemetery have reported nothing unusual in the decades since Earl Combs' resignation, though the position has historically been difficult to fill, with most employees citing vague discomfort about the older section of the grounds. The caretaker logs from October 1994 remain in a filing cabinet at the Virginia Department of Historic Resources, available to anyone who requests them. Most do not. Most have never heard of Earl Combs, or Caroline Whitmore, or the thing that waited at her grave on that October night. But the records exist. The testimony exists. The wet footprints that were photographed on Earl's bedroom carpet before his admission to Western State exist, preserved in a file that no one has opened in over a decade. Some places hold their dead more tightly than others. Some graves are not content to simply receive. And somewhere in the oldest section of Briarwood Memorial Park, beneath a headstone that promises peace in still waters, something remains that knows no peace at all. Something that waits in the mist and the dark. Something that weeps with eyes full of black water. Something that followed a man home and never stopped following until he came back to kneel before her stone. Earl Combs kept his promise in the end. He visited her grave, and whatever found him there, made sure he would never leave it again. Now we will begin our fourth story. The recording was never supposed to leave the archive. 17 minutes of ambient audio, captured on a cold October night in 2008, filed away with hundreds of hours of similar footage that paranormal investigation teams accumulate and forget. But someone listened. Someone always listens. And what they heard in the static changed everything they understood about Greendale Cemetery and the 43 small bodies buried in its western corner. The team had arrived in western Massachusetts on the 12th of October, 4 investigators from a regional group that specialized in historic burial grounds. They had chosen Greendale for its age, its isolation, and its reputation among local historians as a site of persistent, unexplained phenomena. The cemetery itself dated to 1847, sprawling across 7 acres of sloping hillside where sugar maples had grown so thick their canopies blocked the moonlight entirely. But it was the children's section that had drawn them specifically, a fenced quarter-acre near the cemetery's lowest point, where the ground stayed perpetually damp and moss grew thick on stones, too small to bear adult names. Patricia Holloway was 43 years old that October, a former social worker who had turned to paranormal investigation after a series of experiences in her childhood home that she never discussed publicly. She had been part of the team for 6 years, known for her methodical approach and her resistance to suggestion. She did not frighten easily. She did not imagine things. Her colleagues trusted her observations precisely because she reported only what she could verify, dismissing 90% of what others might call evidence as environmental contamination or psychological projection. The children's section of Greendale Cemetery contained 43 graves arranged in uneven rows that followed the natural contour of the hillside. Most of the stones were simple, weathered beyond legibility, their inscriptions worn smooth by more than a century of New England winters. But the Historical Society had preserved records of every burial, and those records told a story that the town had worked hard to forget. In the autumn of 1892, diphtheria had swept through the mill workers' tenements on the east side of town. The disease moved through the cramped housing like fire through dry timber, and it took the children first. 17 had died in a single week at the outbreak's peak, their small bodies buried in hasty succession as grieving parents watched the earth close over one child while another lay dying at home. The investigation team set up their equipment at 9:30 in the evening, positioning audio recorders at 3 points around the children's section, while Patricia conducted a baseline sweep for electromagnetic anomalies. The night was cold, temperatures hovering near 40 degrees, and a low fog had begun to gather in the cemetery's lowest sections where cold air pooled against the hillside. Patricia moved slowly among the small headstones, her boots leaving dark prints in the wet grass, her breath visible in the beam of her flashlight. She felt nothing unusual at first, only the particular heaviness that old burial grounds often carried, the accumulated weight of grief pressed into the soil over generations. At 10:17, she paused beside a grave near the section's northern edge. The stone was newer than most, replaced sometime in the 20th century, and the inscription remained legible. Abigail Marsh, aged 7 years. Taken by fever, October 1892. Sleep now, little one. Patricia noted the grave's location in her field journal and moved on. She did not notice that the temperature around the stone had dropped 8 degrees in the 30 seconds she stood beside it. She did not notice because the cold had already begun to spread. The first anomaly appeared in the audio at 10:23. Later analysis would identify it as a frequency shift in the ambient static, a subtle modulation that could not be attributed to equipment malfunction or environmental interference. The shift lasted 4 seconds. Then it repeated. Then it began to layer, frequency upon frequency, building like voices joining a chorus. The investigators' equipment continued recording, capturing what none of them could hear with their physical ears, sounds that existed just below the threshold of human perception. Patricia was standing near the section's center when she felt the first touch. Something brushed against the back of her jacket, a light pressure near her left hip that she dismissed immediately as a low-hanging branch. She turned anyway, her flashlight sweeping the space behind her, and found nothing but fog and darkness and the endless rows of small stones. She made a note in her journal about possible wildlife activity and continued her sweep. She did not mention that she had felt fingers. She did not mention that the touch had felt deliberate. The singing began at 10:31. The audio equipment registered it as a series of harmonic frequencies that rose and fell in a pattern that acoustic analysis would later identify as melodic structure. The song was faint, buried beneath layers of static and wind noise, but it was unmistakably human. Small voices, high-pitched and thin, weaving together in a melody that none of the investigators recognized. A folklorist consulted during the subsequent review identified it as a Victorian-era nursery rhyme called "The Grey Lady's Garden," a song that had been popular in New England mill towns during the 1882, before falling out of use entirely by 1910. No commercial recordings of the song existed. No written notation had survived. The folklorist had only heard it once, sung by her grandmother, who had learned it from her own grandmother, who had worked in the Greendale mills. Patricia felt the second touch at 10:34. This time, there was no mistaking it for a branch. Small fingers wrapped around her wrist, cold and solid and impossibly strong, and pulled. She stumbled forward 2 steps before catching herself, her flashlight beam swinging wildly across the graves. The grip released. The fog around her seemed thicker suddenly, pressing against her face like damp cloth, and she could hear something beneath the silence. a sound like children whispering just beyond the range of comprehension. She called out to her colleagues. Her voice sounded muffled, swallowed by the fog before it could carry. The equipment malfunctioned at 10:37. All 3 audio recorders failed simultaneously, their batteries draining from full charge to empty in less than 4 seconds. The team's handheld radios produced only static. 2 flashlights flickered and died. Patricia found herself standing in near total darkness, the fog so thick she could no longer see the cemetery's perimeter fence, surrounded by small graves whose occupants had been dead for more than a century. She saw the Grey Woman at 10:39. The figure appeared at the section's eastern edge, materializing from the fog as though the fog itself had decided to take human form. She was tall and thin, dressed in clothing that Patricia's mind refused to fully process. Dark fabric that seemed to shift and flow without wind, a face that was somehow both present and absent, features that existed in peripheral vision but dissolved when viewed directly. The woman stood motionless for 3 seconds. Then she began to walk. Her movement was wrong. Patricia would later struggle to articulate exactly how, but the wrongness was immediate and visceral, a gliding motion that suggested legs moving beneath the dark fabric, but produced no corresponding shift in the figure's height or posture. She moved between the graves with the familiarity of someone who had walked this path countless times, her route weaving among the small stones in a pattern that seemed deliberate, purposeful, ceremonial, and she was not alone. They emerged from the fog behind her, small figures that barely reached the Grey Woman's waist, pale shapes that moved in her wake, like children following a teacher through a schoolyard. Patricia counted 7 before her vision blurred, before the cold became so intense that her eyes watered and froze against her cheeks. They were singing. She could hear it now, not through her ears, but somewhere deeper. A melody that bypassed her auditory system entirely and resonated in the hollow spaces of her chest. The Grey Lady's garden grows so deep, where little children fall asleep, and in the morning when they wake, the Grey Lady's hand they'll take. Patricia tried to run. Her legs refused to cooperate, locked in place by cold that had seeped past her skin and into her muscles, her bones, the very structure of her will. The Grey Woman turned toward her. The children turned toward her. 43 small graves surrounded her, and she understood with absolute certainty that not all of their occupants had remained beneath the earth. A hand touched her face. Small fingers, cold as river ice, traced the line of her jaw with a gentleness that made the horror worse somehow, made it intimate and tender in a way that true violence never was. She looked down. A girl stood before her, perhaps 7 years old, wearing a white dress that had yellowed with age and soil. Her face a ruin of diphtheria's work, throat swollen, eyes sunken, lips pulled back from teeth that had loosened in their sockets. The girl smiled. She was holding something against her chest, a porcelain doll with painted eyes that seemed to track Patricia's movements. The Grey Woman was close now. Patricia could smell her, a scent of turned earth and copper, and something sweeter underneath. Something that might have been flowers left too long in standing water. The woman's hand reached toward Patricia's face, and the cold that radiated from those fingers was not merely physical cold, but something older, something that existed before warmth had meaning, a cold that was not the absence of heat, but the presence of something else entirely. Patricia Holloway's colleagues found her at 6:42 the following morning. She was sitting cross-legged in the center of the children's section, her eyes open but unresponsive, her skin so cold that the paramedics initially believed she had died of exposure. In her arms, clutched against her chest with a grip that took 3 people to break, she held a porcelain doll. The doll's dress matched the description of the one buried with Abigail Marsh in 1892. Its face had been hand-painted in a style that had not been used commercially since the Victorian era. Cemetery records confirmed that Abigail Marsh's grave had been opened at some point during the night. The soil was disturbed in a pattern consistent with something emerging rather than something being removed. Patricia Holloway spent 4 days in the hospital, treated for severe hypothermia and psychological shock. She never told the doctors what she had seen. She never told her colleagues, her family, or the countless researchers who contacted her in the years that followed. She resigned from the investigation team within a month of the incident. She moved to Arizona, as far from New England as she could manage without leaving the country. She never visited another cemetery, but certain habits revealed what words refused to confirm. Patricia Holloway has not slept in complete darkness since October 2008. Every room in her home contains a nightlight. She cannot hear children singing without leaving whatever space she occupies. She keeps the porcelain doll locked in a safe deposit box at a bank in Phoenix, unable to destroy it, unable to keep it close, unable to explain why she took it from the cemetery or what compelled her to hold it through the long hours of that October night, while small hands touched her face and a gray woman whispered secrets that human language cannot contain. The 17 minutes of audio recorded that night remain in the possession of the original investigation team. They have been analyzed by acoustic engineers, paranormal researchers, and skeptics, and every analysis produces the same result. Voices beneath the static, small and high, and layered like a chorus, singing a song that should not exist on any modern recording. The children of Greendale's 1,892 outbreak were buried in haste by parents too grief-stricken to observe proper funerary customs. Local historians have speculated that certain rituals were neglected, certain words left unspoken, certain boundaries between the living and the dead left undrawn. The Grey Woman appeared in local folklore long before 1892, but the outbreak gave her something she had previously lacked. The outbreak gave her a congregation. The children's section of Greendale Cemetery remains accessible to visitors, though the Historical Society has removed it from official tour routes. Maintenance workers report that the grass in that section never grows properly, that equipment malfunctions with unusual frequency, that the fog gathers there on nights when the rest of the cemetery remains clear. They do not speak of the figures they have seen walking among the small graves after sunset. They do not speak of the singing that sometimes rises from the lowest part of the hillside when the wind falls silent and the cold settles in. They do not speak of these things because speaking would require believing, and believing would require accepting that 43 children who died in terror and pain more than a century ago have never stopped waiting for someone to join them in the Grey Lady's garden. Now, we will begin our fifth story. The letter was found folded inside a King James Bible, tucked between the pages of Ecclesiastes, pressed flat as if it had been placed there decades ago and never touched again. Herman Voss had been dead for 3 days when his daughter discovered it while sorting through the sparse belongings of his one-bedroom house on the outskirts of Greencastle, Indiana. The paper was yellowed, the handwriting cramped and unsteady, and the words it contained would never be shared with the rest of the family. She read it once, placed it back inside the Bible, and drove to the county sheriff's office that same afternoon. The document was logged into evidence as a matter of routine, though no crime had been committed. It was later transferred to the Indiana State Archives, where it remains sealed in a folder labeled simply Voss, Herman J., Personal Effects 1983. What follows has been reconstructed from that letter, from employment records held by Oakmont Cemetery, and from a single interview conducted with the gravedigger who replaced Herman Voss in the weeks following his death. That man, whose name has been withheld at his request, spoke only once about what he experienced. He has not spoken of it since. Oakmont Cemetery sits on 17 acres of flat Indiana farmland, bordered on 3 sides by soybean fields, and on the 4th by a narrow creek that runs dry every summer and floods every spring. The oldest graves date to 1847. Their headstones now illegible, their names erased by wind and rain, and the slow, grinding passage of time. The newer sections are neat and orderly, arranged in rows that stretch toward the tree line like the ribs of some vast and sleeping thing. It is the kind of place where silence feels less like absence and more like presence, a weight that settles on the shoulders of anyone who lingers too long among the dead. Herman Voss began working there in 1956. He was 24 years old, recently returned from a brief and uneventful stint in the army, and in need of employment that would not require him to speak to many people. The cemetery suited him. He was a quiet man by nature, and the work was honest, hard on the back, easy on the mind. He dug graves. He filled them in. He trimmed the grass around the older plots and replaced the flowers that families left behind when the petals began to curl and brown. For 5 years, he performed these duties without incident, without complaint, and without any awareness that something beneath the soil of Oakmont was waiting for him. The night of the 14th of October, 1961, was cold and moonless. Herman arrived at the cemetery just after 4 in the morning, his breath visible in the beam of his flashlight, his boots crunching on the frost-hardened grass. A burial was scheduled for 9 o'clock. A local farmer named Willard Greer, dead of a stroke at 63, and the grave needed to be finished before the family arrived. Herman had marked the plot the day before, measuring the dimensions with a length of twine and driving wooden stakes into the corners. The section was old, one of the earliest in the cemetery, and he had been instructed to dig carefully. There were no accurate records of what lay beneath that part of the grounds. Previous interments had been logged in a ledger that was partially destroyed in a fire in 1902, and the precise locations of several graves had been lost. Herman began to dig. The earth was hard from the overnight freeze, and progress was slow. He worked by the light of a kerosene lantern set on the grass beside him, its flame flickering in the stillness, casting long and trembling shadows across the headstones. The only sounds were the bite of his shovel, the shift of the soil, and the occasional distant call of an owl somewhere in the fields beyond. He was nearly 4 feet down when the shovel struck something that was not stone. He assumed at first that he had hit a root. The old oaks along the northern edge of the cemetery had spread their root systems far beneath the ground, and it was not unusual to encounter them during excavation. He adjusted his angle and drove the blade down again. This time, the resistance was different, softer. He knelt at the edge of the hole, lowering the lantern, and brushed the soil away with his gloved hand. What he uncovered was not a root. It was a hand. The skin was gray, stretched tight over the bones beneath, and the fingers were curled into a loose fist as if frozen in the act of grasping. Herman would later write that his first thought was not fear but irritation. He had disturbed an older burial, an unmarked grave that predated the cemetery's records, and now he would have to report it and delay the morning service. He reached for his shovel, intending to cover the hand and dig elsewhere. When the fingers moved, they uncurled slowly, one by one, like the legs of a spider testing the air, and then they closed around his wrist. Herman Voss was not a small man. He had spent years hauling dirt and stone, and his grip was strong enough to bend a horseshoe if the mood struck him. But the strength that held him now was something else entirely. It was cold and absolute, a pressure that seemed to bypass his muscles and settle directly into his bones. He tried to pull away. He could not. He tried to scream. No sound came. The soil around the hand began to shift and fall away, collapsing inward as if something beneath was rising to meet him. Herman saw the arm first, gray and withered, the flesh hanging loose in places, the elbow bent at an angle that suggested it had once been broken and never properly set. Then the shoulder, then the neck, and then, emerging from the black and churning earth like a swimmer surfacing from a frozen lake, the face. It was a man's face, or had been, once. The skin was drawn so tightly over the skull that every ridge and hollow was visible beneath it, the cheekbones sharp as blades, the jaw hanging slightly open to reveal teeth that were too long and too numerous. The nose had collapsed inward, leaving only a dark cavity, and the lips had pulled back into a permanent rictus that might have been a smile or might have been something far worse. But it was the eyes that Herman Voss would remember for the rest of his life. They were open, they were aware, and they were looking directly at him. The thing in the grave did not speak. It did not need to. Herman would later write that he understood, in that moment, that it had been waiting not for rescue, not for release, but for him specifically, for the one who would eventually dig deep enough to find it. He did not know how long it had been there. He did not know what it was. He knew only that it was smiling at him, and that the smile was patient, and that patience, in a thing that old, was the most terrifying quality it could possess. Herman tore his arm free. He did not remember doing it. He did not remember climbing out of the grave or running across the cemetery or reaching his truck parked on the service road near the gate. He remembered only the cold, a cold that had seeped into his wrist where the hand had gripped him, a cold that would never entirely leave, not even on the hottest days of summer, not even decades later, when he sat in the sunlight on his porch and tried to convince himself that what he had seen was a hallucination brought on by fatigue and darkness and too many years spent among the dead. He never reported the incident. He returned to Oakmont the following morning, his wrist wrapped in a bandage he claimed was the result of a fall. And he finished digging the grave for Willard Greer in a different section of the cemetery, 30 yards from where the thing had reached for him. He never dug in that section again. He never walked through it. He avoided it so completely that other workers began to notice, though none of them ever asked why, and Herman never volunteered the truth. But the truth followed him home. The knocking began that same night. 3 knocks, evenly spaced, coming from somewhere beneath the floor of his bedroom. He searched the crawl space. He inspected the foundation. He found nothing. The knocking returned the next night, and the night after that, and every night for the next 22 years. Always 3, always from below, always in the same rhythm, as if something beneath the earth was tapping on the underside of the world, reminding him that it was still there, that it had not forgotten, that it was waiting. Herman Voss never married. He never moved from the house he had rented since returning from the army. He worked at Oakmont Cemetery until 1983, when he was found dead in his bed by a neighbor who had noticed that his truck had not moved in several days. The coroner ruled it heart failure. His face, according to the death certificate, bore an expression of profound distress, though this was attributed to the physical strain of cardiac arrest. His wrist, the one that had been grabbed, was found pressed against his chest, the fingers curled as if clutching at something that was no longer there. The letter was discovered 3 days later. His daughter read it, understood enough of what it described to be frightened, and surrendered it to the authorities. The sheriff who logged it into evidence reportedly read the final line aloud to his deputy before sealing the folder. "He's been waiting for me to come back down." Herman Voss was buried at Oakmont Cemetery, per the wishes of his family. The grave was dug by a man named Carl Reiter, who had worked at the cemetery for less than a year. Carl completed the excavation without incident, attended the brief service, and helped lower the casket into the ground. He filled in the grave that afternoon, tamping the soil flat and placing a temporary marker at the head. He drove home that evening, ate dinner with his wife, and went to bed at his usual hour. He resigned the following week. When asked for a reason, he said only that he had experienced disturbances during the burial that he was not prepared to discuss. Pressed for details, he refused. He left Greencastle shortly afterward and did not return. Efforts to contact him for this reconstruction were unsuccessful. A neighbor who knew him during that period recalled only that Carl had mentioned hearing something while filling in Herman Voss's grave, a sound that had come from deep in the earth, muffled but unmistakable. 3 knocks, evenly spaced, rising from below. The section of Oakmont Cemetery where Herman Voss first unearthed the hand remains in use today. The plot he abandoned in 1961 was eventually filled by another burial in 1979, though records indicate that the gravedigger assigned to that excavation requested a transfer to a different cemetery within 6 months of completing the work. No explanation was recorded. The current groundskeeper, when asked about the older sections of Oakmont, reportedly changes the subject. He has worked there for 11 years. He has never, to anyone's knowledge, dug a grave in that part of the cemetery after dark. The handwritten letter of Herman Voss remains in the Indiana State Archives, filed and forgotten, its pages slowly yellowing in the climate-controlled silence of a basement storage room. The words it contains have not been read in decades. The truth it describes has not been verified and likely never will be. But the earth at Oakmont Cemetery is patient. It has kept its secrets for more than a century. And somewhere beneath the frost and the roots and the long, slow wait of the dead, something that was buried before the cemetery was a cemetery, something that should not have been aware but was, something that smiled at a young gravedigger in 1961 and waited 22 years for him to return, that something is still there. It is still waiting. And if you listen closely, on the coldest nights of October, when the moon is dark and the fields are silent, and the only sound is the wind moving through the headstones, you might hear it. 3 knocks, always 3, rising from below. Now we will begin our 6th story. The soil of Harmon County, Oklahoma, holds more than wheat and memory. It holds secrets pressed deep into red clay. Secrets that seep upward through root systems and cemetery plots. Secrets that do not stay buried no matter how much dirt is shoveled over them. In the spring of 1979, in a small cemetery called Resurrection Hill, something happened during a funeral that would never be explained, never be understood, and never be forgotten by the handful of people who witnessed it. A suppressed police report, buried in county archives for decades, contains testimony from 7 individuals who attended the funeral of local farmer George Aikman on April 14th of that year. Their accounts are consistent. Their trauma is documented, and what they described defies every natural law governing the boundary between the living and the dead. George Aikman had farmed 200 acres of winter wheat outside the town of Hollis for 37 years. He was 61 years old when his heart stopped beating in the cab of his tractor on a Tuesday afternoon in early April. His body was discovered by his youngest son, who had walked out to the north field to call him in for supper. The tractor was still running. George was slumped against the steering wheel, his eyes open, his face carrying an expression his son later described as confusion rather than pain. The death was ruled natural. The funeral was scheduled for Saturday. The service would be held at Resurrection Hill Cemetery, where 4 generations of Aikmans had been laid to rest beneath modest granite markers and the shade of blackjack oaks. The morning of April 14th arrived under a sky the color of old pewter. The air was thick and still, carrying the mineral smell of rain that had fallen overnight and soaked into the red Oklahoma earth. 23 people gathered at the cemetery that morning, standing in a loose semicircle around the open grave and the bronze casket that rested on the lowering mechanism above it. Pastor David Hensley of First Baptist Church stood at the head of the casket, his Bible open, his voice carrying across the quiet gathering as he began the eulogy. He spoke of George's dedication to his family. He spoke of his work ethic, his quiet faith, his love for the land. He spoke of the hope of resurrection and the promise of eternal rest. It was during the 3rd minute of the eulogy that attendees first noticed something wrong. Martha Aikman, George's widow of 39 years, was the first to hear it. She was standing closest to the casket, her black-gloved hands clasped in front of her, her eyes fixed on the spray of white carnations covering the bronze lid. She heard what she initially thought was an echo, Pastor Hensley's voice bouncing off the granite monuments and returning a half-second delayed. But the delay was wrong. The rhythm was wrong. And after a moment, she realized with a coldness that started in her stomach and spread outward through her limbs that the second voice was not repeating what the pastor had already said. It was speaking in unison with him, word for word, syllable for syllable, as if someone else had memorized the eulogy and was reciting it at the exact same moment from somewhere very close by, from somewhere beneath the carnations, from somewhere inside the casket. Martha did not scream. She was not the screaming kind, but her face went white, and her daughter Caroline, standing beside her, saw the change and followed her mother's gaze downward toward the bronze lid. Caroline heard it then too. The voice was muffled but distinct. It was speaking the same words the pastor was speaking, but there was something wrong with its tone, something flat and mechanical, like a recording played at the wrong speed. Pastor Hensley continued for another 12 seconds before he stopped. He stopped because he heard it too. Everyone heard it. The cemetery went silent, except for the voice coming from inside the casket. The voice did not stop when the pastor stopped. It continued speaking, and what it said was no longer the eulogy. It said the name George Aikman. It said it slowly, with a strange emphasis on each syllable, as if tasting the sounds. Then it said the name David. It said the name Martha. It said the name Caroline. It said the name Thomas. It said the name Ruth. It said every name present at that funeral, one by one, in a tone that carried no emotion, No warmth, no recognition, only a cold and terrible awareness. Attendees reported that when the voice spoke their name, they felt something they could not adequately describe in their police statements. They used words like watched. They used words like claimed. One man, a neighbor named Harold Pruitt, said it felt like something had reached into his chest and wrapped its fingers around his heart, not squeezing, just holding, just letting him know it was there. The voice fell silent after it had spoken the last name. Pastor Hensley stood frozen at the head of the casket. His Bible had fallen from his hands. His face, according to witnesses, had gone gray, the color of the sky above them. He did not speak. He did not move. It was Thomas Aikman, George's eldest son, who finally broke the paralysis. He stepped forward and placed his hand on the casket lid. He later told police that the bronze was cold, not the coolness of morning air, but a deep, penetrating cold that seemed to radiate outward from whatever was inside. He did not open the lid. He could not make himself open the lid. He stepped back, and no one else stepped forward. The funeral was abandoned. The lowering mechanism was left in place. The mourners walked away from Resurrection Hill Cemetery in silence, their shoes squelching in the wet red clay, their faces carrying expressions that would haunt the town for years. Pastor Hensley did not return to his church that Sunday. He spent 3 days in his home with the curtains drawn before his wife finally convinced him to speak. What he told her was never recorded, but she was seen weeping in the church parking lot the following week, and their marriage ended before the year was out. Cemetery workers returned to Resurrection Hill the following morning to complete the burial. The foreman, a man named Wendell Cobb, who had been digging graves in Harmon County for 22 years, approached the casket with 2 of his crew. The sky was clear, the sun was bright, and the bronze lid of George Aikman's casket was ajar by approximately 3 inches. Wendell Cobb stopped walking. He told his crew to stay back. He approached the casket alone, his boots sinking into the soft earth, his breath coming short and fast. He did not want to look inside. Every instinct he possessed told him to walk away, to leave this grave unfilled, to find another profession in another county. But he looked. He had to look. George Aikman's body had moved. At the funeral home, the body had been prepared in the standard fashion. The hands had been folded across the chest, fingers interlaced, positioned over the heart in an attitude of peaceful rest. What Wendell Cobb saw through the 3-inch gap was different. George Aikman's hands were no longer folded. They were pressed flat against the interior surface of the casket lid, palms down, fingers splayed, as if the dead man had been pushing upward with all his strength. The funeral director, Clement Marsh, was summoned to the cemetery. He examined the body without touching it. He confirmed that the hands had been folded when the casket was closed. He stated for the record that rigor mortis, which would have set in fully within 12 hours of death, would have made any movement of the limbs physically impossible. He had no explanation. He offered no theory. He resigned from Marsh Family Funeral Home 3 weeks later and moved to Amarillo, where he never worked with the dead again. George Aikman was buried that morning. The casket lid was closed and sealed. The grave was filled. A granite marker was placed. The incident was not discussed publicly. The police report was filed and suppressed. The people of Hollis returned to their lives and tried to forget what had happened at Resurrection Hill. But forgetting proved impossible for those who had been there. 4 attendees of the funeral, Martha Aikman, Caroline Aikman, Thomas Aikman, and Harold Pruitt, reported recurring nightmares in the weeks that followed. The nightmares were identical in their essential details. They would wake in darkness, unable to move, aware that someone was standing at the foot of their bed. The figure was George Aikman, but it was not George Aikman. It wore his face, his clothes, his farmer's hands with their calloused palms and dirt-stained fingernails. But its eyes were wrong, empty, and lightless, like holes cut in a mask. And its mouth moved constantly, forming words without sound, shaping names over and over in an endless, silent recitation. The nightmares did not stop. They came every night for weeks, then every few nights, then once a week, but they never stopped entirely. Martha Aikman began sleeping with the lights on. Thomas Aikman began sleeping in his truck, parked in the driveway. unwilling to be inside a house with rooms where the figure could stand unseen. Harold Pruitt stopped sleeping altogether, or tried to, drinking coffee through the night and nodding off in his chair, jerking awake whenever the silence grew too complete. Caroline Aikman, George's eldest daughter, told no one about her nightmares. She was a private woman, 41 years old, unmarried, living alone in a small house on the edge of town. She had been close to her father. She had been the one to choose the carnations for his casket, and she was the one the figure visited most often. On October 3rd, 1979, approximately 6 months after her father's funeral, Caroline Aikman was found dead in her home. The discovery was made by a neighbor who had noticed 3 days of uncollected mail in Caroline's mailbox. The neighbor knocked, received no answer, and contacted the sheriff. Deputy Raymond Stokes entered the home through an unlocked back door. He found Caroline in her bedroom, lying on her back in bed, the covers pulled up to her chin, her hands at her sides. The room was orderly. There was no sign of struggle, no indication of illness, no evidence of foul play. Ellis Hammond examined the body and ruled the cause of death as cardiac arrest, natural causes, case closed. But Deputy Stokes included details in his report that did not align with a peaceful death. Caroline Aikman's face, he wrote, was frozen in an expression of absolute terror. Her eyes were open, fixed on the ceiling, pupils dilated to their maximum extent. Her mouth was open as if in mid-scream. Her fingers were curled into the mattress so tightly that the fabric was torn in several places. And there were marks on the hardwood floor at the foot of her bed, long parallel scratches in the varnish, as if something had been standing there, shifting its weight, dragging whatever it had for feet back and forth across the wood for hours, for days, for however long it had taken to finish what it had come to do. The scratches were never explained. The expression on Caroline's face was never explained. Her death was filed alongside her father's funeral in the suppressed records of Harmon County, and the incident was never spoken of again by those who remained. Martha Aikman died in 1986. Thomas Aikman moved to California in 1981 and never returned. Harold Pruitt lived another 20 years but refused to discuss what he had witnessed, even on his deathbed, even with his own children. Resurrection Hill Cemetery still stands on the outskirts of Hollis, Oklahoma. George Aikman's grave is there, marked by a simple granite headstone weathered by 4 decades of wind and rain. Visitors to the cemetery have reported hearing things they cannot explain, a voice on still afternoons, murmuring names in a tone that carries no warmth, no recognition, only a cold and patient awareness. Groundskeepers have reported finding the soil over certain graves disturbed in the morning, as if something had been pressing upward from below. And the scratches on Caroline Aikman's bedroom floor, preserved now only in a photograph attached to a police report that no one reads, remain the only physical evidence of what visited her in those final months. Some doors, once opened, cannot be closed. Some voices, once heard, continue speaking long after the speaker should have fallen silent. And some of the dead do not rest, they wait, patient and watchful, for the living to join them in whatever cold and endless place they now inhabit. The police report from Harmon County remains suppressed. The witnesses are gone, but the grave at Resurrection Hill remains. And on certain nights, when the Oklahoma wind falls silent and the darkness settles thick over the red clay earth, there are those who say you can still hear it, a voice speaking names, one by one, in a tone that suggests it has all the time in the world. Now we will begin our 7th story. The work of preserving the dead is quiet work. It requires patience, precision, and a tolerance for solitude that most people do not possess. Dr. Alan Marsh had spent the better part of 3 decades engaged in this labor, documenting the forgotten corners of American burial grounds, cataloging the names and dates of those whom time had otherwise erased. He was a cemetery historian by profession, a title that drew equal parts curiosity and discomfort from those who learned of it. But to Dr. Marsh, there was nothing morbid about his calling. The dead, he often said, were simply the past made visible. His job was to ensure they remained so. In the spring of 2014, he began what would become his most ambitious project, a comprehensive photographic archive of Calvary Rest Cemetery in upstate New York. The cemetery sprawled across 47 acres of rolling hillside, its oldest sections dating back to the late 18th century. Generations of farmers, merchants, soldiers, and children lay beneath its soil, their headstones weathered by centuries of frost and rain. Many of the inscriptions had become illegible. Entire family plots had sunk into the earth, their markers tilting at impossible angles. The local historical society had commissioned Dr. Marsh to document everything before it was lost forever. He worked alone. He preferred it that way. The cemetery was closed to visitors during his documentation sessions. The iron gates locked behind him as he moved methodically through the grounds with his camera and tripod. Each headstone received the same treatment: a wide establishing shot, a close-up of the inscription, and a detail photograph of any decorative elements. He recorded the GPS coordinates of every grave, cross-referencing them with burial records stored in the county archives. The work was slow. It was meticulous. Over the course of 3 years, he captured more than 4,000 photographs. He did not review them immediately. The files accumulated on external hard drives, organized by section and date, waiting for the winter months when he would begin the painstaking process of cataloging and annotation. It was not until January of 2016 that Dr. Marsh finally sat down at his computer and began scrolling through the images. The first anomaly appeared in photograph number 847. Taken in the northeastern quadrant of the cemetery on a gray afternoon in October 2014, there was a figure in the background. Dr. Marsh leaned closer to his monitor. The figure stood approximately 30 yards behind the headstone he had been documenting, positioned between two larger monuments. It appeared to be a man, dressed in dark clothing that blended almost seamlessly with the shadows cast by the surrounding trees. The figure was partially obscured, visible only from the shoulders up, its face turned slightly away from the camera. Dr. Marsh remembered that afternoon. He remembered the silence, the smell of wet leaves, the way the clouds had hung low and heavy over the hills. He did not remember seeing anyone. The cemetery had been empty. He was certain of it. He had walked the entire perimeter before beginning his work, as he always did. There had been no cars in the parking lot, no footprints in the soft earth, no sound of movement among the stones. He continued scrolling. The figure appeared again in photograph number 1203, and again in photograph number 1567, and again in photograph number 2114. Each time, it stood in the background, always partially hidden, always watching. The clothing was the same. The posture was the same. The positioning was always such that the figure seemed to be observing Dr. Marsh from a distance, tracking his movements through the cemetery without ever being seen. 17 photographs in total, spanning 3 years of documentation, taken across different sections of the cemetery, in different seasons, under different lighting conditions. And in every single one, the same figure. Dr. Marsh felt the first cold thread of unease wind through his chest. He told himself there had to be an explanation. A groundskeeper, perhaps. A trespasser who had somehow evaded his notice. A trick of light and shadow that his mind was now interpreting as something human. He enlarged the images one by one, searching for details that might confirm his rational hypotheses. The figure did not move between photographs. It did not age. It did not change position within the frame. It simply appeared, frozen, as though it had always been there, as though it had been waiting. In 16 of the 17 photographs, the figure's face was turned away or obscured by shadow. But in photograph number 3412, taken on a cold November morning in the cemetery's oldest section, the face was visible. Dr. Marsh stopped breathing. The face was not human. It could not be human. The proportions were wrong in ways that made his eyes ache to look at. The skin was pale, almost gray, stretched tight over bones that seemed too sharp, too angular. The eyes were sunken, black pits that reflected no light. And the mouth hung open, the jaw distended far beyond what anatomy should allow. The lips pulled back to reveal teeth that were too long, too numerous, arranged in rows that disappeared into the darkness of the throat. Dr. Marsh pushed back from his desk. His hands were shaking. He told himself it was a glitch, a corruption in the image file, a digital artifact that his exhausted mind was misinterpreting. He closed the photograph and opened it again. The face remained. He zoomed in. The face remained. He adjusted the brightness, the contrast, the saturation. The face remained, frozen in that impossible expression of hunger or agony or something for which there was no name. He did not sleep that night. He sat in his study with the lights on, scrolling through the cemetery's burial records, searching for any connection to the location where photograph number 3412 had been taken. The coordinates placed the image in Section A, Row 7, Plot 14, the oldest part of the cemetery, where the first settlers of the township had been laid to rest. The plot belonged to a man named Silas Underwood. Dr. Marsh found the name in the county archives, buried in a collection of newspaper clippings from 1887. Silas Underwood had been a farmer who lived alone on a remote property at the edge of the township. In the autumn of that year, the bodies of 7 people had been discovered in the root cellar beneath his farmhouse. They had been arranged in a circle, their hands bound, their faces carved with symbols that the newspapers of the time refused to describe. Silas had been arrested without resistance. He had not spoken a single word throughout his trial. But he had smiled. Every account mentioned it. He had smiled from the moment of his arrest until the moment the noose tightened around his neck. The execution had been carried out on the grounds of the county jail, and his body had been interred at Calvary Rest Cemetery by order of the court. No family had claimed him. No mourners had attended. His grave had been unmarked for nearly a century until a local historical society had placed a small stone to identify the plot. Dr. Marsh stared at the photograph on his screen. The face stared back. The mouth hung open. The eyes were fixed on something beyond the frame. Something that might have been him. He told himself he needed to go back. He needed to photograph the grave again, to prove to himself that there was nothing there, that the figure in his images was nothing more than a trick of light and shadow. He told himself this even as every instinct he possessed screamed at him to delete the files and never think of Calvary Rest Cemetery again. He returned on a Saturday morning in late February. The sky was the color of old bone. The temperature hovered just above freezing, and the ground was hard beneath his boots as he walked through the iron gates and into the cemetery. He carried his camera, his tripod, and a small notebook in which he had written the coordinates of Silas Underwood's grave. The cemetery was silent. No birds sang. No wind stirred the bare branches of the trees. Dr. Marsh's footsteps were the only sound, crunching softly against the frost-covered grass as he made his way toward Section A. He found the grave without difficulty. The stone was small, weathered, barely visible among the larger monuments that surrounded it. The inscription was simple: Silas Underwood, 1851, 1887. Nothing more. Dr. Marsh set up his tripod and raised his camera. The viewfinder went dark. He checked the battery. Fully charged. He checked the lens. Clean. He pressed the shutter button, and the camera made a sound he had never heard before. A low, grinding whine that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside the mechanism. The screen flickered. The image distorted. And then the camera went dead. Dr. Marsh lowered the device and stood very still. The temperature had dropped. He could see his breath now. Thick white clouds that hung in the air before dissipating. The silence had changed. It was no longer the absence of sound. It was the presence of something listening. He heard breathing behind him. It was slow, wet, close. So close that he could feel the faint displacement of air against the back of his neck. The breathing did not match any rhythm he recognized. It was too slow, too deliberate. As though whatever was making the sound had forgotten how lungs were supposed to work. Dr. Marsh did not turn around. He could not turn around. Some part of him understood, with a certainty that bypassed thought entirely, that turning around would be the last thing he ever did. He stood frozen, his camera clutched against his chest. his eyes fixed on the small gray stone that marked the grave of Silas Underwood. The breathing grew closer. He felt something cold brush against his shoulder, not a hand, not exactly, but something that might once have been a hand. Something with too many fingers that moved in ways fingers should not move. Dr. Marsh walked. He did not run. Running would have been an invitation. He walked, slowly, steadily, his eyes fixed straight ahead, his breath coming in short, controlled bursts. He walked past the tilting headstones and the sunken plots and the iron fence that marked the cemetery's boundary. He walked to his car and opened the door and sat behind the wheel and did not look back. He drove home in silence. He did not turn on the radio. He did not call anyone. He walked into his study and sat down at his computer and opened the folder containing the photographs from Calvary Rest Cemetery. The files were corrupted, every single one. 3 years of work, 4,000 photographs, reduced to fragmented data that his software could not read. Error messages filled his screen. The images were gone, all except one. Photograph number 3,412 remained intact. Dr. Marsh opened it with hands that had gone numb. The figure was still there, standing among the stones in Section A. But something had changed. The mouth was no longer open. The jaw had closed, the lips pressed together in a thin, pale line. And the eyes that had been fixed on some distant point beyond the frame, were now looking directly at the camera. Directly at him. Dr. Marsh stared at the photograph. The photograph stared back. He deleted the file. He emptied his trash. He reformatted his hard drive. When he turned on his computer the next morning, the photograph was there, restored to his desktop. The face filling his screen. The eyes fixed and unblinking. He never returned to Calvary Rest Cemetery. He never completed the archive. He resigned from his position with the Historical Society and moved to a small apartment in a city 300 miles away, where there were no cemeteries within walking distance, where the sound of traffic drowned out the silence. But the photograph remains. It appears on his devices without warning: his phone, his laptop, his tablet. Always the same image, always the same face. The mouth is still closed. The eyes are still watching. And sometimes, late at night, when the city grows quiet and the darkness presses against his windows, Dr. Marsh hears breathing behind him, slow, wet, close. He does not turn around. Cemetery records from Calvary Rest confirm that plot 14 inches Section A remains occupied. Groundskeepers have reported equipment malfunctions in the area, sudden temperature drops, the sensation of being watched. No photographs of the section have been successfully taken since 2016. Those who have tried report the same experience. Cameras that malfunction, images that corrupt, files that disappear and reappear without explanation. Silas Underwood was executed 138 years ago. His smile was noted in every account of his trial. What the accounts did not note, what perhaps no one understood at the time, was that some smiles are not expressions of joy. Some smiles are promises, and some promises, it seems, are kept forever. Now we will begin our final story. The coastline of Maine has always belonged to the dead as much as the living. The sea gives up its bodies slowly, and the land remembers every one of them. Whitfield Memorial Cemetery sits on a hill overlooking the harbor town of Millbrook, its iron gates facing a road that winds down through salt-eaten pines toward the water. The cemetery was established in 1847, and its oldest stones have been worn smooth by generations of fog rolling in from the Atlantic. The newest sections spread toward the tree line, where the ground is still soft, and the grass hasn't yet learned to grow thick over what lies beneath. For over a century and a half, the dead of Millbrook have been carried up that road and through those gates. The living have always assumed the journey only went one direction. Dana Reeves took the night security position at Whitfield Memorial in the spring of 2019. She was 53 years old, recently divorced, and looking for work that would keep her mind occupied during the hours when sleep refused to come. The job was simple. She sat in a small booth near the main entrance, monitored the security cameras, and walked the grounds twice per shift to check for vandalism or trespassers. The cemetery had experienced problems with teenagers in previous years, broken bottles, spray paint on the older monuments, the usual small violations that the living inflict upon the dead. Dana's presence was meant to discourage such intrusions. She was not meant to encounter anything that required courage. The maintenance log she kept was a standard document. She recorded the time of her patrols, noted any irregularities, and signed off at the end of each shift. The entries from her first 6 months were unremarkable. Fog, deer in the newer section, a fallen branch on the Hendricks family plot, the quiet administrative language of a woman doing a job that asked little of her. But in the final weeks of her employment, the entries began to change. They grew longer, more detailed. The handwriting, previously neat and efficient, became cramped and hurried, as though Dana was trying to capture something before it escaped her memory. On November 3rd, 2019, she wrote that she had heard the main gate open at 1:47 a.m. The security camera showed nothing. The gate remained closed on the monitor, but she had heard the distinctive groan of its hinges, the heavy clang of iron meeting iron. She dismissed it as wind, though there was no wind that night. On November 5th, she heard it again. This time, she walked to the gate and found it standing open by approximately 6 inches. She closed it, checked the lock, and returned to the booth. The camera footage from that night shows Dana approaching the gate, but the gate itself appears closed in every frame. On November 8th, she reported hearing the gate open and close 7 times between midnight and 4 a.m. She stopped going to check. She wrote that she didn't want to see what she might find. The entry from November 14th, 2019, her final shift, is the longest in the maintenance log. It spans 4 pages. The handwriting deteriorates as the account progresses, becoming almost illegible in the final paragraphs. What follows is reconstructed from that document, from the police report filed the following morning, and from the observations of the paramedics who found Dana Reeves sitting motionless in her booth as the sun rose over Whitfield Memorial Cemetery. The fog came in around 11 p.m. that night, earlier than usual. Dana wrote that it moved strangely, not drifting in from the harbor as it typically did, but seeming to rise from the ground itself, as though the cemetery was exhaling. By midnight, visibility beyond the booth windows had dropped to less than 30 feet. The security cameras showed only gray static where the graves should have been. Dana made her first patrol at 12:30 a.m., walking the perimeter path with her flashlight. She reported that the fog was cold in a way she had never experienced. Cold that seemed to press against her skin rather than simply surrounding it. The beam of her flashlight created a small tunnel of clarity ahead of her, but beyond its reach, the fog was absolute. She completed her patrol in 22 minutes and returned to the booth. She did not leave it again until 3:17 a.m. The gate began its performance at 1:15 a.m. Dana heard the first sound, clearly through the booth's thin walls, the metallic shriek of hinges that hadn't been oiled in decades, followed by the reverberating clang of the gate meeting its frame. She looked at the monitor. The camera showed fog. Nothing else. She heard the gate open again at 1:23, 1:31, 1:44, and 1:58. Each time, she checked the monitor. Each time, the monitor showed nothing. The fog had become a wall, impenetrable and absolute. And behind that wall, something was playing with the entrance to the cemetery, opening and closing the door to a place where only the dead were supposed to reside. At 2:30 a.m., Dana called the Millbrook Police Department non-emergency line. She reported suspicious activity at the cemetery and requested that a patrol car drive by when convenient. The dispatcher noted her call and said someone would check in within the hour. That call was logged. The patrol car never arrived. The officer assigned to the route reported that he drove past the cemetery at approximately 3:05 a.m. and saw nothing unusual. The gate was closed, the booth light was on, and the fog had begun to lift. He did not stop. He did not see what Dana Reeves saw 12 minutes later. At 3:17 a.m., Dana made the decision to investigate the gate herself. She wrote that she couldn't stand the sound anymore, that each clang was like a nail being driven into her skull. She took her flashlight and her radio and walked the 112 feet from the booth to the main entrance. The fog had not lifted for her. If anything, it had thickened, becoming almost solid as she approached the gate. She could taste salt in it, and something else beneath the salt, something organic and old. The gate was standing open, not partially open, as she had found it on previous nights, but fully open, both sides thrown wide, as though welcoming a procession. Dana pointed her flashlight through the opening, down the road that led away from the cemetery toward the harbor. The beam illuminated perhaps 40 feet of cracked asphalt before the fog swallowed it entirely. For a moment, she saw nothing. Then the fog shifted, or perhaps her eyes adjusted, and she saw them. They stood in the road in rows, like mourners at a funeral, facing the cemetery entrance. Dana counted them automatically, the way she counted headstones on her patrols, 12 in the first row, 15 in the second, more behind them. They were dressed in clothing that spanned centuries. A woman in the front row wore the heavy black fabric and veiled bonnet of Victorian mourning attire. Behind her stood a man in a suit that Dana recognized from old photographs of her grandfather, 1,940 seconds, tailoring with wide lapels and high-waisted trousers. There were others in clothing. She knew a woman in a dress from the 1,970 seconds, a teenage boy in a modern hoodie and jeans. They stood motionless. Their faces were pale, drained of the flush that living blood provides. Their eyes caught Dana's flashlight and reflected it back with a shine that human eyes do not possess, the tapetum lucidum glow of animals caught in headlights. Dana wrote that she could not move for what felt like several minutes. She stood at the open gate with her flashlight beam trembling across those silent figures, and none of them moved, and none of them spoke. The fog curled around their legs like affection. The only sound was her own breathing, harsh and rapid in the absolute stillness. Then, without deciding to do so, she stepped backward and closed the gate. The iron was cold against her palms. The lock engaged with a click that seemed impossibly loud. She turned and walked back to the booth, forcing herself not to run, feeling their eyes on her back the entire way. She reached the booth and locked the door behind her. She looked at the security monitors. The camera facing the road showed empty fog. The camera facing the gate showed iron bars, closed and latched. Dana turned to the window and looked out toward the entrance. They were standing at the gate now. All of them, pressed against the iron bars like children at a zoo exhibit, their pale faces pushed between the vertical posts, their hands wrapped around the metal. The woman in Victorian mourning dress was directly in front, her veil pushed back to reveal features that had been beautiful once, before whatever had happened to make them this way. The man in the 1,942nd suit stood beside her, his eyes fixed on the booth, his mouth slightly open. Behind them, the others crowded close, layered in rows that extended back into the fog. Dozens of figures, perhaps hundreds, all of them facing Dana, all of them waiting. Dana tried to call for backup. She picked up the radio and pressed the transmit button and heard only static. She tried her cell phone. The screen showed no signal. She tried the landline in the booth, a relic that hadn't been used in years. The line was dead, not the silence of an inactive connection, but a dead sound, a sound like earth filling a grave. She was alone in the cemetery with things that should not have been able to stand, things that should have been lying beneath the stones she walked past every night. She wrote that she sat in the booth for almost an hour, not looking at the window, listening. The fog pressed against the glass. The night made small sounds, the settling of old wood, the distant cry of something in the harbor, the creak of iron that might have been the gate or might have been something else entirely. At 4:22 a.m., she heard footsteps on gravel. Not the shuffling of many feet, but the deliberate pace of someone walking with purpose. The footsteps grew closer. They passed the booth without stopping. They continued toward the interior of the cemetery. Dana looked at the monitor showing the main path. She saw a figure walking between the headstones, moving away from the entrance, moving toward the newer sections where the graves were still settling. The figure was wearing a dress she recognized, a blue dress with small white flowers. Her mother had been buried in that dress in 2003. The log entry becomes fragmented here. Dana wrote that she looked out the window again and the figures at the gate were gone. She wrote that she heard the footsteps returning, closer now, circling the booth. She wrote that she saw faces at the windows, pressing against the glass, fogging it with breath that should not have existed. She wrote that one of them was smiling at her, and she knew that smile. She had known it her entire life. And it was wrong. It was wrong. Because that smile had been lowered into the ground 16 years ago and covered with earth and prayed over and mourned. The final lines of the entry read, "They're inside the cemetery now. They're walking toward the booth. The one in front looks like my mother. My mother died in 2003. She's smiling at me. The entry stops. Dana Reeves was found at 6:47 a.m. on November 15th, 2019, by the morning shift groundskeeper. She was sitting in the security booth with her hands in her lap and her eyes open. She was breathing. Her pulse was normal. She did not respond to her name. She did not respond to touch. She was transported to Millbrook General Hospital, where she was admitted for evaluation. The attending physician noted that she showed no signs of physical trauma, but exhibited symptoms consistent with catatonic stupor. She was transferred to a psychiatric facility in Portland 3 days later. Dana Reeves has not spoken since that night. She sits in a room with a window that faces away from the ocean, and she does not look at anything. And she does not respond to questions. Her medical records indicate no improvement in the 4 years since her admission. The staff report that she becomes agitated only at night, when the fog rolls in from the harbor and the building settles into darkness. On those nights, she turns toward the window, even though she cannot see the ocean from her room, and she watches something that no one else can see. The position of night security officer at Whitfield Memorial Cemetery was eliminated following the incident. The iron gates remain closed after sunset. The cameras record only fog and stone and the slow patience of the dead. But groundskeepers have reported finding the gate standing open on certain mornings, its hinges groaning in winds that don't exist. And visitors to the cemetery have spoken of seeing figures in the fog, standing motionless between the headstones, dressed in clothing from eras long past, watching them with eyes that shine in the darkness. In coastal Maine, the sea gives up its bodies slowly. And sometimes, it seems, the land gives them back.